This one is on. Yeah. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Denis Maksimov. I am a curator of art and programs here at the Pushkin House. Warm welcome for those of you who are here for the first time. And tonight we have an incredible talk and conversation between Aziza Kadyri and Dr. Alyce Mahon. Aziza probably does not really need much of the introduction in the Pushkin House, as she's plastered all over the walls here for 3 months right now, and already hosted numerous different events. But nevertheless, Aziza Kadyri is a contemporary interdisciplinary artist who's based here in London, and she represented Uzbekistan in the Venice Biennale, 60th Venice Biennale that just closed. About 2 months ago. Was it 2 months ago in Venice? And she also has simultaneous running 4 shows currently around, including here in the Pushkin House for 1 more week. And in general, she's an exciting contemporary art practitioner who is working with a variety of materials and variety of media, including textile and the experimentation with AI in digital art. And you'll hear way more about her practice later. And especially warm welcome as well to the Dr. Alyce Mahon. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak tonight and to moderate the conversation about the practice of Aziza. Dr. Alyce Mahon is a professor of modern contemporary art at the Cambridge University and a fellow of Trinity College. She also is the inaugural co-editor of the Journal of Surrealism, published by University of Minnesota Press. And she's a curator of numerous exhibitions as well on surrealism, and she's champion, in a way, of women in surrealism and women working with the body politic and their body as well in performance. So there are a lot of form of intersections, actually, between the work of, I think, Alyce as an academic, a researcher, as well as a curator, and Aziza's practice. And tonight's talk exactly is about this synergy and about this great form of the interchange of those subject and forms. So without further ado, I'm passing the microphone to Aziza.
Well, I think I'll thank. I am working, yes. So I'll thank Denis and all of you for coming, both in person here in Pushkin House on this slightly cold Friday evening in London, as well as online. I'm delighted to be here with Aziza and to talk, yes, about sort of several aspects of her art practice. So our idea is that obviously there's elements of the personal and the political across her work over the past few years. She is a young, very exciting, very successful artist, but I think it's important for us to think about where she sits within art practice, art history, narratives around textiles, around performance, the whole phenomenon of the Biennale, the Venice Biennale, which we were talking about together over coffee earlier, which is a kind of a huge success for a young artist to be in a pavilion, as well as a huge responsibility. And of course, she rose to that challenge, and so I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the pavilion, which I enjoyed seeing myself in person, as well as the show here and wider questions. So in terms of what we're hoping for the next 45, 50 minutes before we open it to the floor, is we were planning to talk about stories that have been told, that have been marginalized, that are being retold, and that idea of her story for art history and for her practice, as I say. And I think if we have the technology correct, we can, am I correct? Yes, nod to tech. What we were thinking of is, obviously we're talking about issues around colonialism, identity, ideology, Uzbekistan, and the kind of its profile. Next slide, please. Will I do it? Voila, there. And this is where we have, we have a globe to, again, put us within that global frame, to think about where we are here today, which is on the far left of that globe in London and Britain, which is not the center of the universe, to think about Uzbekistan and to think about Aziza, someone who was born in Russia, who was educated or trained, schooled in Russia, but also who did a degree in fashion design from Tsinghua University in Beijing in 2017, and then went on to do a master's in performance practice and design at Central St. Martin's in London. So that's, as I was saying to earlier, quite an unusual trajectory, quite a transnational kind of cartography to have mapped before she's even reached 30. For openers, I wanted you to perhaps briefly rehearse for our audience that map for you as an artist, coming from those sort of three quite different geopolitical terrains. You're between Uzbekistan and UK at the moment in terms of your studio practice. You're just back from Istanbul, where you're visiting family over Christmas. As I say, the element of Beijing in the mix is a curious one. So could you please fill us out a little bit on that CV, if you like?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'll just briefly talk about my sort of migratory journey, I guess, because it is quite important to my practice, and it informs a lot of my practice, as you'll see a bit further in the presentation. I was born in an Uzbek family, so I'm 100% Uzbek. My entire family comes from Tashkent. But I was born in Moscow because, you know, when my father went to university in Moscow and everything, it was still the same country, it was still the USSR, so it wasn't kind of a big leap or anything. So I was born there, but immediately I was moved back to Uzbekistan, to Tashkent, and then I spent my childhood, about 6 years in my childhood in Taipei, in Taiwan, which has really kind of had a lot of influence, I think, subconsciously on to the ways I think. And then again, as you said, educated primary, secondary school in Moscow. Then when I was 17, I moved to Beijing to do fashion design, and it's not a very obvious choice, I think, to anyone to do that. But to me, it was also a way to kind of escape as the eldest child, eldest daughter, and also in an Uzbek family where being an artist wasn't really a path for anyone. I had to get a real job and do art as a hobby. But something in me when I was 17, I think, you know, I was really weirdly brave back then. I don't think I would be able to do the same thing now. But I kind of went out of my way. I was like knocking on the Chinese embassy's door for them to give me a scholarship and stuff. So I managed to get a scholarship and get away from my future of going into MGIMO, which is a, I don't know, people know, okay. Yeah, because I got into MGIMO, I was going to be a diplomat. But then I dropped out after one day of university. After the lecture with Lavrov, I was like, no. Well, I didn't technically drop out. I took academic leave, which they weirdly gave it to me. I went to the dean and I was like, hey, I'm taking academic leave. I barely started my studies. They were like, fine. So I went to China and I got into this art school in Tsinghua University in fashion design. And that was my way to kind of, you know, follow my own path. And I only convinced my parents to, you know, be able to continue this because they didn't have to pay for my education because I got that scholarship because I was knocking on the Chinese embassy's door like this. Yeah, however, studying fashion design, and as much as I enjoyed it, I didn't really enjoy the industry, so kind of mid-studies, I was like, oh, I really like theater and I really like worlds, and I feel like there's a certain kind of ceiling that I've reached in terms of creativity when you think about commercial fashion, but I didn't want to kind of stay within that. I wanted to do something weird. I wanted to do wearable sculptures and stuff. So I just went to my professors and I said, hey, I got an internship at this theater and I'm going to do theater costumes from now on. And they said, okay. Weirdly, people say okay to me. And then that's how I got into theater. And I worked in theater as an assistant, then as a designer. I started from costumes, going into set design, and I think performance and theater and everything around it still informs my practice incredibly strongly. You know, these ideas of the bard, the storyteller, immersive environments, narrative environments. This is something that continues happening, you know, working site specifically, working with the space, thinking about the emotions that are elicited, and so on. And that's why I went to do the master's here, because it was about performance design and performance practice and pushing this idea of performance outside of the traditional theater space and working in a more experimental way. But what happened when I graduated, COVID started, so I didn't even get to do my final show, unfortunately, which I prepared, like I was working on it for 2 years. But that gave me another opportunity to kind of go into technology and really look at how I can work with immersive environments in AR, in VR, kind of taught myself that over the pandemic, which is also something that is now kind of perpetuated in my practice. So yeah, overall, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing right now.
Well, I was going to say you did graduate with distinction too, even though you didn't have your grad show. But in terms of that trajectory and the role of, let's say, gender specifically in your approach to those different media, I think design. Again, we were talking a little bit about the training system at Tsinghua University. If you think about what your education in Russia, then in Beijing, then over in London, to what extent were you sort of conscious of a canonical narratives going on or hierarchies? Because usually when we think about performance, it's something that a lot of feminist artists immediately embraced, as well as textiles, as a way of asserting or giving voice to women's lives, practice, work, etc. And I'm wondering whether some of your early work did use the word canon and sort of decentering the canon in that sense. Yeah. So was there a moment from the schoolgirl who decides to go get her scholarship and take the leap to move to Beijing? Was there a moment there too, which is very Western focused, often in the training, I mean, still looking at Renaissance sort of approach and aesthetic debates in terms of training in Beijing. When did something happen where you moved towards performance, Central St. Martin's, and thinking actually there's something about me being a female artist that also wants to do something different with textiles, sculpture, etc.? Yeah,
it happened actually. Yeah, it's good that you asked this question. I didn't expect this question, but the reason I got into Central St. Martin's and I had no idea I would ever get in is because, you know, there was this period between my BA and MA where I was actually working in theatre, and it was a very difficult time for me, especially as a young woman in the theatre industry in Moscow, where I had to constantly assert myself, not just to men, but also older women. And it was a very toxic kind of environment to work in as a 23-year-old that is just trying to do things that are nice and good and interesting. And for me, it was colossal experience in terms of like, okay, I got to work with Bolshoi theater, I got to work with Nemirovich and Danchin, Stanislavskого, like these huge theaters. But emotionally and kind of spiritually, I realized that I was in a sort of a trap where I wasn't really working on any of my own ideas, and I was constantly being put down. And applying to Central St. Martin's was just a way for me to have a goal in life and just have something to look forward to. There wasn't even a goal of like getting onto the course. I just wanted to prove something to myself. And then I got onto the course, and then it was the whole question of how am I going to pay for it, but that's another conversation. But yeah, one of the reasons I got onto the course is because there really was this moment where I was kind of crushed by this kind of, okay, I have no voice, and there's also all these hierarchies that are built that I cannot break in a way. So I saw people working in the same position as I was in their 40s, women, and still doing the same things, 20 years later. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. And also I realized that I'm not using my own voice, and going onto the performance course was in my head, an opportunity to do that. And it really gave me confidence in what.
And had you a sense that moving to London was going to open more doors for you as a female as well as an artist, or a female artist?
I've never been to London before that, and I just thought, oh wow, UK, so exciting. I speak English, so it's nice. It was just, yeah,
I think I was wondering, because there was also the sense that a lot of Chinese universities and art schools were also looking to London as a place where one could make money and have success as an artist too. So there was a kind of obviously a career. It wasn't. It was researched as a move in that sense, no? Or Central St. Martin's in particular.
I think, yeah, in a way, because I was doing a fashion course at Tsinghua, and obviously Central St. Martin's is really known for the fashion. So for a lot of my course mates, it was a dream to get onto the MA fashion course, for example, and stuff, which I didn't want to do. But then I found this course on performance design and practice, which is it is quite a peripheral course in Central St. Martin's, but I think that is the benefit of the course, because you know, fine art and fashion can be very competitive and even vicious sometimes. Because I know a lot of people who are on these courses, but PDP is kind of left alone, and we were just left alone to do our own little weird performances and stuff in our festivals. And in comparison to other disciplines, it was really fostering collaboration.
Yeah. Are there also, the audience will see that I've put up images of kind of what we might call the sort of women who were paving the way for a new approach to fibre art, to textiles, normally as in Cecilia Vicuna and Sheila Hicks, who are here behind me. To what extent were you, as a student, working with fashion, design, performance? Were there artists that you did look to, who you were thinking about, who were making soft sculpture, fibre art, and making as a kind of new aesthetic? Obviously, these are a generation that perhaps weren't recognized by the art market, certainly by museums, in terms of having major retrospectives, being in the Tate, being in the Centre Pompidou in Paris, as we sort of see with Vicuna and Hicks. So I'm wondering again, were there, as an art historian and teacher, was there artists that you thought, okay, that's inspiring me? Because we often find women artists saying, on the one hand, they're not hearing women artists' names or major shows devoted to them. On the other, there can be women helping women. So again, was that something that came into play or no?
Much later, actually.
Right.
So I came to these references so much later, I think, not really a long time ago, because again, as I said, you know, I came into the world of contemporary art or visual art through theatre. So for the longest time, my references were costume designers or like theater things, even if they were, you know, fiber art or like big soft sculptures, they were made for performance. So this is something that I was using as references. And I think, and I've been thinking about this a lot, why do I work with textiles? And it's not just because, you know, I did fashion design and this is a medium that I'm really familiar with, you know, the plasticity of the textiles and everything kind of paralleling with the ideas of like the kind of metaphorical ideas that I look at, you know, and being adaptive, being like assimilating different environments and stuff. But also a realization that I came to a bit later in my practice is that actually, you know, the whole mother side of my family were involved in the textile industry for different reasons, mainly the reason of the cotton industry that was really, really blown out of proportion by the Soviet policies and so on. And I'm doing a few projects about that, about my grandfather who was working on like cotton refining machines, and then my grandmother also, who has been featured in that piece. She did a lot of stuff around cotton and education and the textile industry, and then my mother, like my entire family graduated from the Textile Institute. So I was always surrounded by these concepts and ideas and these media, and I think subconsciously this is why I feel so at home when I work with textiles.
Well, I was thinking, and one of the reasons I did put up Cecilia Vicuna, who was that she talks about textiles as an alphabet that can no longer be read. And there's this sense of a lost narrative, a lost vocabulary, and an aesthetic, but also an ethical responsibility to continue, so that it's not passing the baton, but almost sharing the baton and extending those circles. So you've mentioned your family coming from or emerging out of a textile industry and business in that sense, but in your work, it's fair to say that you do this, you bring those voices, that narrative, that sense of an alphabet that needs to be marked. And so I wonder too whether you find that, and particularly with the Biennale and with the exhibitions that you're enjoying, there is finally perhaps an openness, an excitement finally for artists that are using textiles and embroidery and are thinking about how we can share stories differently. But in your case, you've been very determined to almost mix centuries. So on the one hand, you've got the family, the great-grandmothers coming through, which we'll talk about in terms of individual artworks. But as you mention, using technology and using AI, and it's quite an unusual marriage, it's not obvious. And it's like a kind of, two generations sort of clashing to a certain extent. And yet the motif of weaving and stories and very much luring in the public, the spectator, to start unravel and project and understand is critical. So you mentioned it was under COVID where the lockdown, you skilled up once again. You've a fabulous, enviable work ethic. So your logic was you were locked down, so you're going to start studying AI, using it as a further tool. How conscious are you of that being a generational tool for you that actually maybe does something radically different to what this older generation of feminist women artists were doing with textile art in particular, and their mothers and great-grandmothers' skills?
I don't have an answer to this because it's a current exploration, and I started in the pandemic with AR, which is augmented reality, and VR, which is not necessarily AI, because again, this was a tool that really allowed me to simulate to some extent the immersivity of a live performance and whatever. Not very much, but that luckily had become a career for a couple of years until I was laid off during the Biennale opening. Which was a lucky time, there's worse places to get the news.
One door closes and another one opens.
Yeah, that's what everyone said. When I walked in the pavilion like this, I was laid off, and they're like, look where you are. So I worked in AR companies and tech and everything, and it was a great kind of opportunity for me to learn how that industry works, and I'm trying to because I do have a very, very strong interest in the technologies, and I do think that the technologies are not going to go anywhere. AI is not going anywhere. I recently did a lecture, as I mentioned, for a theatre academy in Maastricht. And then the students were like, oh, so what do you think about AI and stuff? I'm like, well, it's a technology that is here, and it is so integrated into our lives that we don't even notice it sometimes. And the main question is, for me, for example, as an artist who is looking to promote the Central Asian kind of identity and culture, because let's be honest, not everyone knows about Central Asia at all. And because not everyone knows about it, the AI also doesn't know about it, because the AI replicates human biases, right? Which is also something that I look at a lot in my art. So how do we then, in this technology, leave our imprint, as young practitioners from Central Asia, women who already don't really have our voices heard, and now the technology that is remembering for us is not remembering us because there is no output that is happening from us. So we have to not be afraid of the technology and keep outputting into it and experimenting with it, just not to be forgotten by history, but also do it in an ethical way where you're not actually stealing anyone else's work, and making sure that you're using your own databases. In the AI that I work with, it's always my own database that I collect and I train it on, and so on. So it's not it's
not hijacked. You're kind of saying, yeah. And then what about? So I think if we sort of move towards that in practice with the Venice Biennale, for example, hence the slide, and this quote around the pavilion and the theme, don't miss the cue. This is a quote from you. I was saying this is from the press release, so it's sort of what we might call broad brush as press releases tend to be, but again, where you state that it's a platform where women's voices converge, each echoing a unique journey of migration, transformation, and resilience. Through art and technology, we reimagine our cultural heritage, weaving together narratives of the past and present to shape a contemporary Uzbek identity. So it's past, present, into future. I mean, biennales are epic in the sense of ambition. And obviously was related to the idea of foreigners everywhere and that sort of sense of how we think through these huge themes of migration, resilience, community building, giving a platform. But I'm wondering again where, if you could explain to the audience, because it was quite intriguing, how you work, because you work from drawings, ideas and sketches through to the sense of how you're going to put textiles, sculptures together that people can engage with, to a further step away to the whole mise en scène of the theatrical use of the space in the pavilion, a big, a brutalist warehouse that you have to somehow, totally radically take over, which you did beautifully. Lending it the colors, the blues, the layers, the textiles. So can you sort of briefly talk about how it goes, as I say, from the two-dimensional to that immersive experience, but with that really, that sort of ambition that it was very much still about women's voices and about something quite layered and personal.
Okay.
I mean, that sounds huge, but I suppose explaining these two drawings, which will, I don't know how many people saw your work in Venice, but again, I can say that having sort of walked into the pavilion and the sort of moody light, I'd love you to explain the blueness, because it was emphatically blue and not an Yves Klein sort of impregnated blue, but something that was sort of moving. There was something which actually was almost, you could hear the color in a very nice way. But there were lots of little, in its labyrinthine form, little ways of sort of pulling you into corners, dark and light. Whether there was technology in one corner, the sort of layered blankets. I was asking a bit about that because the invigilator was like somebody who was selling tickets or popcorn to the side. It was quite old school, 1950s. So that, so that there was little, and then the stage and chairs, as we have here, these kind of chairs. So that there was lots of different layers, and you're wondering who's, the notion of theatricality was being unplugged. But when I saw the drawings which began it did begin very much with the object, with the textile, with the costume and softness. And then you took over that that rather daunting space, I would imagine.
I'm not sure it began with the small objects and then grew into big one. I think it began actually with the big space, and then I kind of narrowed it down to the things that could actually populate the space. I have to say that, I wasn't the only person working on the pavilion. It was a huge team. Without whom everything would have been just impossible, completely impossible. A lot of wonderful collaborators, associate artists. I don't know if Camilla is here. No, Camilla's not here. She was going to come, but anyway. So Camilla, who lives in London as well, she was also part of the team. It's funny you mentioned these drawings, because actually these drawings, I hate sketching. That's why I don't paint either. I'm not a big painter. I work really well with 3D concepts, and I work really well with like three-dimensional things in real life, but also in Blender, like in your computer, like the 3D programs. And actually, most of the sketches that I made that were put into production were done in 3D, or somehow they were created with a three-dimensionality in mind. And these sketches were made for the commissioner and the people who cannot look into my brain to understand what I'm actually trying to do. So I think the main purpose of these sketches was actually to maybe convey the shapes to other people rather than be used as production material. But still, then they were included in the brochure and stuff.
Well, it is interesting because when I was there, I think I said there was about half a dozen. Now, I was there twice, but the second time in October, the fact that you can actually, touch hangings, but also that you could actually stick a hand into a work. This is quite unusual, performative, and it wasn't as if often also you have that's more directive. So you're sort of forced to do that as you're moving through, often in pavilions. And that sort of imposes quite differently on the body of spectators. These perhaps allow people at least to see how one could play, and that there's a ludic element in that sense. And yet theatres are sort of places where normally we're quiet and we watch the stage and we wait for the exit sign and the arrows, and it is quite ritualistic as a space. So there's sort of little pockets of tension. So that was, I think, the only reason why these slightly show how you kind of spot somebody doing something and then go, oh, okay, I can actually stick my hand through, someone else can. I was talking about how all these things become selfie moments for people.
Which we planned for.
Yes, so that's also something which you sort of, there's an element of encouraging that curiosity, irrespective of the geopolitics of the pavilion or the artist. And so I thought that was very clever. It's quite manipulative. It's theatrical, obviously. You're pulling people in, there are props. So there's tensions there that
I make people
are interesting.
Perform as well. I think what I really care about in my practice is that everything I do is accessible. Not just physically, but also kind of, emotionally and intellectually and everything, and that, the pavilion doesn't have to be experienced necessarily with like the knowledge of like the entire history of womankind in Uzbekistan. Yeah. You don't have to know that. You can go in and just experience it emotionally, and like the way we designed it was also, there's an emotional journey, and then at specific points, even if you have no idea what Uzbekistan is, or what is being shown on the videos, or what is being like played on the sound, because it was a holistic installation with like all these elements, you could still feel very emotional about it, and like at certain points feel uncomfortable, in a sense like there's discomfort because in the end, and you've been there, like there's this stage area where suddenly you're blinded by stage lights, and you see people staring at you just like you're staring at me right now. Kind of the audience has already gone through the experience. So there's a lot of like these tensions, as you say, that sometimes we're confusing people, which is something that I wanted to happen, but also sometimes we're creating these unexpected results where people would start performing on the stage, which was completely empty and wasn't even a stage, but because of all the signifiers that were there, they were like, oh yeah, this is a stage. People are looking at me. We have videos of people like waltzing, and there's a woman reciting Shakespeare, and she posted it on Instagram, and I only saw it because of that, where she said that she hadn't been acting for 25 years or something, and then being on this stage made her want to act again, and she was going to do it from now on. So I'm like, okay, this is an outcome that I couldn't really predict, but it's something that I really wanted to happen. And obviously it doesn't come from understanding the pavilion from a historical point of view or anything, but it's just a very kind of empirical, emotional experience, which I care about a lot as a former theatre practitioner.
That also links to the idea of the collective. So, it did work. So you might like to explain. So you conceived of that sort of the pavilion in that sense, but worked with the Qizlar Collective, who you were co-founder of, okay, as a Tashkent-based female artist group, and also Qizlar meaning girl, no? Girls. So again, this is just some members and some non-members of the collective, but that sense of trying to use a collective for the pavilion, but also create a collective space. How did that work in terms of you working with people with different skill sets to really produce quite a nuanced pavilion?
So a little bit about Quizlar. It's not necessarily an arts collective. We have artists and designers and people who work in the creative industries, but also people who don't. And it's more of a like socially engaged, grassroots, activist, feminist collective. And we are about 16 or 17 people right now. It's quite fluid because obviously, we don't. It's not a job. we don't really get paid for it, so we kind of put in our efforts when we can outside of our regular jobs and families and stuff. And what was I going to say? Yeah, and so the Biennale is just one of the many projects that we were involved in. And when I was invited to do the pavilion, immediately I was like, okay, a question of representation that always really bothers me. I was just invited to do a national pavilion and represent a country that I didn't even grow up in and I don't even have citizenship in, despite my entire family being from there. How do I justify that to myself? How do I kind of say, okay, yeah, I have the full right to represent and like my experience is going to be represented. And it's not how I work because, you know, we created this collective almost 3 years ago. Precisely because we wanted to kind of highlight how heterogeneous Uzbekistan is and the young generation that grew up after the independence in '91, how really different we all are, and some people speak Uzbek, some people don't, some people only speak Tajik, Karakalpak, and our collective is very, like we have, we represent a lot of the urban community. Of course, we cannot represent, for example, the rural community. It's something that we, you know, you can't represent everyone. But I wanted to bring in the collective to create this multiplicity of voices and have more of a collective kind of, I forgot the word in English, collective. Anyway, yeah, so I wanted it to be a work that would represent a multiplicity of voices, and there were not the entire collective took part because also, you know, there was a limit on resources that we could and time. But then the girls basically they did amazing research and they engaged with the community that we already work with anyway, and we've invited even more women to come in and contribute and tell their stories, share the stories. And we don't like to say that those were interviews because they were more like conversations that were horizontal, and they were really happy to kind of give their experiences to us, and we like tried to handle them very kind of respectfully and put them into the pavilion in various ways, very poetically. So every single piece that you see in the pavilion kind of represents the different stories that or maybe an amalgamation of the stories that we got from the community about migration, about the sense of home, about what it feels like to be maybe the first generation of women who are actually able to more or less freely leave the country and experience the world outside and so on.
That again is a sort of a press quote there, which is about and I've just highlighted the multi-layered nature of identities, being part of a group, lived experiences. So I think you've captured that sense of wanting a kind of openness and fluidness, if you like, not trying to pin something down, but then again to give people a sense of how that translates into an artistic experience. Can you speak a little bit then about the works in it and the use of Medina, no? Who you the Suzani master, who you use again to translate ideas and design into actual fabrics, and also the fact that again, you know, you have the very tactile kind of mood around the pavilion. So I was again struck by people. It's the first thing, and people probably do this when they came into this room. I mean, the first thing people want to do with textile art is touch, and we immediately, and normally the first thing, particularly if you're a mother, you do is immediately say, don't touch, don't pull it, don't do anything. But actually the fact that there was a combination of the very much lived real experience and people touching, and then the screens was quite unusual, and as sort of bedfellows, as I mentioned.
Touch the screens if you want. It's just not as interesting.
We're very comfortable touching screens, and as are our children.
We had a little swing there.
So yeah, that's something that that's become far too much of a reflex. But it does show, I think that's a good slide to show the kind of layers of the pavilion in that sense. But again, thinking about using Suzani, and to what extent you wanted people to know the specifics, you know, what we call the kind of glocal of it, that sort of the local within that global stage. Perhaps you might comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit to the different kind of media that you found in the pavilion, why they were there. We didn't have a lot of time to prepare the whole pavilion, and I think when I was first asked to do it, I kind of sat down, I was like, okay, we cannot do things that we don't already know how to do. And then in my mind I was like, okay, I am proficient in, let's say, scenography and something that has to do with textiles, costume. I can work with installations and stuff, but that is not enough. And I know that the girls in Qizlar, Nastya Sever, for example, and Kamila Zahidova, they're really good with research and kind of working with the community and creating these situations where interviews can flow really nice. And Kamila has incredible experience in also different feminist initiatives. And the different methodologies of like conducting this research, and then Safia Said Khalil, who was working more on the visual, I guess, the video part. I knew that she would be really great in that, and that would be an amazing way to bring her in to create these videos. And we also had her photography on the side. So this is how basically the pavilion came together. So it was really a rush. To have the concept, and then, okay, we have all this together. And then I really wanted to work with the artisan, because it's a part of my practice. Here as well, you can see, you know, I work with Yıldız Muhidinova, who is a wonderful collaborator of mine for a few years already, who's an embroiderer. But for the pavilion, it was Madina Kasimbayeva, who has worked a lot with the commissioner before, and it was a great way for me to kind of get introduced to her practice as well, because she's probably the most well-known and prominent Suzani embroiderer in the country. And it was really interesting to work with her as well, because she has her own studio where she trains and employs young girls, often from very unfortunate situations, environments, and she gives them the skills, she gives them the opportunities, and they all work together. And like, I think we had about 20 women working on the textiles. They're all credited in the catalog that you can find downstairs, which was something that was really important to me, to kind of include every single person who's worked on this. And I forgot what the question was. It was about embroidery. Yeah.
I think again, it was that sense of the layers where actually there was close-up skill set. And again, and that is where there's like the embroidery, which is so beautiful and so intricate, and then there's sort of layers, and one was still allowed to touch these artworks in that sense back to the screen. And then the next shot shows you actually something which almost, there's again a nice Again, there's a nice contrast, I find, and even when we were sort of talking about the sort of the theatre and rather, what's the word? Again, brutalist metal screens there versus the gorgeous embroidery. There's a kind of difference in the coldness in the metal and the embroidery, and that I think was something people were finding, depending on how many people were there. And then you have, as you can see here again, or the audience can see, the spotlight. So you're sort of pulling and pushing people back and forth. Yeah. And I did ask you this about the blue, which was very, I found, and of course, you are stepping out of Venice and the sunlight. You know, you're in Venice and very in the Arsenale and very bright. And then there's the blue, which has many different associations for people. It can be associated with Catholicism. I happen to be Irish, so one would think of Mary. You can think, I said Yves Klein, I always sort of feel is a very macho blue, just because we know it's sort of his impregnation of blue. Blue, you said, is cold. I would never think of blue as a cold color, but I grew up beside the sea, so I would see it as something which envelops quite maternally or something. So again, how much was that part of a collective decision? How much was that a part of actually masters sort of saying this is the palette we're going to use as they're working with a team, and you saying I want to feel a blueness, a blue thought and a blue shade? It
was my decision, but it was largely informed by the research that was done by the collective, because during the research we found a lot of these feelings of like, invisibility, social invisibilities, maybe some occurrences where, you know, the experiences weren't seen and weren't acknowledged. And there's this very specific fabric, and I wanted to wear this dress today, but I didn't for some reason. I should have worn it. I have a dress made out of this fabric, which is called bekasam. And there's very different variations of it, but there's a type of bekasam that is made in Tashkent, which is kind of important for us to be grounded in the locality of Tashkent as well, because this is where we operate mainly. Which is a very plain fabric. It's just blue. Oh, actually, you can see it in one of the works over in the bar. You'll see it. It's a leftover fabric from the pavilion, because eco-conscious. So it's a blue and black stripe, and it's very plain on one hand, so it's never celebrated in any of the great big exhibitions in the Louvre or like in the British Museum, whatever. But still, it's for a person from Uzbekistan to see this fabric as a very like familiar feeling. You just see it and you know, oh, this is what is used for like men's chapan, like the jackets and stuff. And there was this metaphor of like this fabric being so traditional and prominent and familiar, but also never celebrated, and it's like this invisible fabric. And to me, that was a metaphor for also this invisible experience, I guess, like an overlooked experience. So this was the starting point of the blue, because it was very blue. And then from that, there were different connections that started growing from the blue. So there was this coldness. The reason I say cold, because the fabric itself, when you touch it, it's really cool, but also the ceramics are very blue, the mosaics are very blue in Central Asia, if you think about these things. And so there's this connection to the urban environment that tends to be very blue dominated. And there's also connection to technology, because blue is the color of technology as well. For me, at least, you know, the blue screen, whenever your computer, that's how the blue screen of death. But like the blue glow, you know, whenever you think about.
There was I thinking blue rivers and, you know, rhizomatic.
No.
So I'm just I'm too old, obviously, but I didn't think of blue.
You know, this is also this. I leave it open to interpretation. You know, there are people coming to the pavilion and looking at the curtains, and there was one particular curtain where I showed women's silhouettes, and a man from, I think he was like South Asia, Southeast Asia, he was like, is that an elephant? I'm like, well, it's not an elephant, but because it is so relevant to your reality, it may as well be like, you know, just interpret it the way you think is good for you.
Whereas I was seeing the killing of Yves Klein, so that's quite, so each to their own, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, and I mean that it does. It's interesting the way, though, you're comfortable with people sort of projecting on and off. Yeah. Maybe at the same time, because you have screens and information and more storytelling, do you want to explain a little bit about how one then leaps into something more specific with that research and the use of technology?
Yeah, so just in general, because we keep talking about how theatrical the pavilion is, but you probably don't even know what we're talking about. So what happens when you walk into the pavilion, you realize that you're in a sort of a deconstructed theater backstage, and you're wandering through this labyrinth of like curtains and random objects, and the first thing you see is like a flight case with some things stacked on top of it. Then there's just a normal garment rack with some jackets on it, which are all an exposition to what you're going into. And then slowly, as you walk through the space, you know, these sculptures that you saw before, these are actually these garment racks kind of morphing into shapes that are familiar to like the urban environments of Tashkent, you know, the sort of grapevine holding things, I don't even know what they're called in English, and then the tapchan, which is like an elevated seating area, and so on. And the costumes as well, like the jackets transform into these mnemonic almost devices where we were trying to embody the memories that were shared with us and so on. And in the end, after going through this journey, and this journey was a metaphorical journey of, you know, it was a combination of the experiences that were shared with us, kind of distilled, I guess, into certain points where you'd be like, okay, this is the beginning of my journey, this is the middle, this is how I felt, and this is the end where I find my community and so on. So there was a narrative journey in there, which wasn't imposed on anyone. Like, we put it in the brochure, but you could also interpret it your own way. And in the end, you go onto the stage, and it is the kind of culmination moment where we're like, oh, are you ready to now, after this journey, be observed, or you want to still be the observer and kind of hide away, or are you ready to be on the stage illuminated? And there's this kind of idea of spectatorship and being looked at and so on. And technology was kind of, it wasn't immediately obvious, this technology integration into the pavilion, because it was so tactile and then textile based and everything. But almost all the pieces were made with the assistance of technology. The most obvious one was the AI conversations that were happening with the visual language of embroidery, and like, you know, some of this is here in the exhibition as well. But then the sculptures, for example, they were all made also by like 3D scanning. Camilla, who was supposed to be here, we were working together, kind of taking the gestures from the research and then recreating those gestures. I would scan them, and then we would manipulate them in 3D and then try to understand how to create a sculpture around that shape, so the person can then go in and repeat that gesture and so on. So even the curtain, is kind of meant to also emulate the way AI diffuses imagery. So it's like it's actually a hazy backdrop of my grandmother's sort of environment, like a childhood home, in mid diffusion. So yeah, kind of embedded in there, but not out very obvious. Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay, we're going to move on to the art that people are enjoying right now in Pushkin House again, which is behind us, which is outside, which is downstairs greeting you, because this continues the motif, obviously, of spinning and tales and storytelling, and involves great-grandmothers and you and found things. But we have, it's not only women's tales in that sense too, I suppose, in the mix. But here, I thought it was curious too, I suppose that was Denis who wrote it, no? The idea that you are a transcultural trickster. So
yes.
This is again, this is the T-shirt that will be in the shop shortly, Transcultural Trickster. But I did think again that was Unusual Bedfellows, and where you're thinking about transcultural and transnational ideas, but also trickery and something playful, which is nice. So do you we'll let you unpack that agreed, presumably.
Tricksters
language.
came from me, and then transcultural came from Denis. The notion of a trickster already appeared in the pavilion, actually, and on the wall text we actually managed to get the word tricksterism on it, which was a big achievement, I think, for myself. I'm really interested in this idea of tricksterism, but not necessarily in the sense of like deceitfulness and not that kind of trickster, but more of an archetype of a trickster who is a storyteller, a bard, an alchemist, a magician, kind of this sense. And I think with this exhibition, I'm going into this research and creation of a trickster persona who would be this kind of exaggerated, slightly exaggerated storyteller who is about this diasporic experiences and having to all constantly code switch and constantly create these kind of magical things around you to be able to keep up with whatever environment you're in. And also because there's traditionally no woman trickster figure in Central Asian folklore, which is interesting. Like there are some trickster figures in Persian, I think, folklore. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, okay. Obviously there's Scheherazade and 1001 Nights and so on, but not in Central Asian folklore. So I'm interested in also like maybe generating very, very kind of hubris, very like trying to,
That makes sense, and also the bard and the theatricality of it. That way.
And the circus kind of it.
Yeah, lovely, yes. So perhaps what we should do is, outside at 9 Moons, which is absolutely gorgeous, really beautiful work hanging suspended, which you'll have all passed, of 2023. So in the stairwell between the floors, so you get it from multiple vantage points too. It works, I mean, it should be permanently here. But it does also...
That was suggested by me.
Yes, I think it's a fantastic, it works so well in what is not an easy space actually, but it's really beautiful work. This is also, this is sort of, again, the bard in you talking about moons, and references very specifically your two great-grandmothers, actually, you know. There's tales of family in that sense. So do you want to sort of perhaps elaborate a little bit on how this idea of trickery falls through? So here we have the three, I'm mindful of the time, so these are the three ones that greet
they're called balancing acts, and they are like circus banners.
Which is interesting.
But we can talk about it later, yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think this is where perhaps that sense again of I was only mindful of the time because I do want to allow people a chance to ask questions too. So then when we have if we put this up, this will work perhaps as a slide, and our moon's there to the left as one shot, versus LC behind, which we can talk about again in a moment. But perhaps just elaborate a little bit then on that sense of trickery, but also the transculture, because you have a kind of mapping and unmapping. You've got torn images, you've got works which are found, as we would say in art historical terms, something which is sort of from a dowry from family objects, as well as family stories passed down to you. So that we need to delve into your life story. We need to sort of, you know, click on a QR code to go down those Alice in Wonderland sort of rabbit holes and find all those stories. And yet, when people walk past it, their first response, I think myself, is something quite visceral and formal, as something that's quite poetic. And then they start to notice the details. I don't know, I'm sure the audiences you can comment on that yourselves. But the color scheme, the details, the intrigue, the fact that you have a young girl whose hair seems to lace off and then is sort of, parachuted up. So there's quite different details and scale moving in and out. So can you perhaps just talk through how that does spin tales for us?
Yeah, I think so. The tricksterism didn't come to me at this point because this is the earliest work in the exhibition. It was made in 2023, not so long ago. But it was the first piece that started my interest in embroidery in general, in Suzani embroidery, because there is this piece of my great-grandmother's dowry that we have had, well, actually two pieces in our family for ages, and I didn't really. So these two are the replicas, like a smaller replicas of the embroidery, and at some point I was just like, oh, actually, well, these are pieces of a bigger thing. What did it look like? Where are the other pieces? So there's a whole research behind that, and for me, this is a way to kind of reconstruct the initial embroidery, which was actually quite huge. It was probably 3 by 3 meters, and it got 9 of these circles in a grid structure, and they're called moon oi, which I found very interesting because my great-grandmother, who had this dowry, her name is Oi Bibi, which means moon dame, moon lady. She never used that name, but it's her legal name. But then I thought reconstructing it faithfully would just be really boring, and maybe it was an opportunity to kind of also metaphorically connect, the disconnection of these pieces with also the disconnection of all the family stories that nobody ever bothered to kind of bring together. And a lot of these stories are oral kind of retellings because none of these stories were ever written down besides one, which is my paternal grandmother's story, where she's got her little diaries and she kind of wrote them herself. So it's still kind of an oral storytelling. And yeah, a way to bring that together, but still not stitch it together to kind of respect the fact that they're all still slightly, not fitting together because all of these stories, I remember them from my childhood and how they were told over a cup of tea. And then when I did this project, I went back to my grandmother, my mother, and I asked about the stories. And the versions they told were kind of different from what I remember. So this also illustrates how these oral stories just become kind of mythologized in many ways and change details and so on. So I'm interested in those kind of inconsistencies. And also the imagery is kind of on purpose quite naive, because, as I said, they're meant to invoke this kind of, childhood imagination. And like the images that I had when I was young, listening to those stories. So as much as I could excavate that from my brain. Yeah, and as you said, like I don't impose those stories on the viewer. I want the person to kind of go in and see, oh, are those kidneys, are those lungs, are those ovaries? People, everyone has different kind of reactions depending on what pains them. But also there is an opportunity to then go in and scan a QR code and then read the stories and look at the photographs and look at the environment. Yeah.
When you say childlike, so I'm curious about that, because also, I mean, I work in the avant-garde and the surrealists. For them, childlike was something, that sense of enchantment that we've lost. And that sort of, obviously, modernity, post-modernity, capitalism is killing the whole time. So again, while you're referring to your own childhood memories and what we share with children and how those become apocryphal or mythologized, is there not still something within that you're sort of hoping to re-energize or to ignite or to activate in the spectator when you say that around something childlike, or where it's, I mean, I know you're talking about the sort of formally or quality of the, or when you're talking about the iconography and it kind of going from something very specific to the image of the female sort of parachuting, let's say, which people can see outside. But isn't that, there is a lovely element of curiosity and wonder, which I certainly think is very exciting about your work, and that does feel to me, you know, I don't want to say neo avant-garde, but I'll say it, neo avant-garde. And that actually then using that sense again of how there's, you know, you complete the work of art. It's the, because you are encouraged to engage, to take, you know, to stand there with the QR code and sort of, as I say, that sort of image of going down different portals is very generous, but also very, very important in 2024, 25.
Yeah. I think the reason I want to be an artist is because I'm chasing constantly this fantasy imagination that I had when I was younger and that I think I've lost. So yeah, a lot of it is just this chasing and trying to remember what I was when I was like 6 years old, before people told me I cannot be an artist because I have to get a real job. So going all the way back to the beginning.
You're following many very successful or important artists' footsteps in saying that. Normally, it's, for some reason, it's that Alice in Wonderland age 6 or 7 that every child decides they're going to be an artist. Their parents tell them to, well, I don't know.
I wanted to be a princess when I was 5.
Or Napoleon or whatever it is. So what about this work which is in the room with us? And thinking about, because on this one hand, while we've sort of talked about something which is the circus storytelling, things that are personal, things that invite the imagination, you know, reactivating that imagination, which is so important. But there's also something which is eco-feminist in a lot of your work as well.
I hope to be more.
Yeah, that's something you're building on in that sense, and certainly with the work which is here, as I say, in this music room. No, the Drought here, the handmade embroidery on Soviet linen, which you can see here in terms of the, I was going to call them mood boards, but I'm sure there's what would you call them?
The research panels.
Research tablets, yes, here, on the walls, which show you, again, the kind of process, which I think is fascinating, working from what you might describe as canonical iconography through to AI-informed kind of disobedience with that. And then the actual artwork, which is, again, produced collectively, no? In terms of ideas being translated into a final work which people see, and which also, I think, has that same effect. It's a beautiful work again, but where you at first perhaps look at it as in terms of cartography, or I certainly as a mapping, which is intended to be, as something which you plunge into the colours and you think of it in terms of formal landscape, and then on closer inspection you see things are actually perhaps again quite hybrid or transcultural. Yeah. So perhaps you might, for you, what would you sort of explain? And the title is modest.
The Drought. The
Drought, except it's very pointed. Yeah. So again, it doesn't mean, it means that if you were sort of putting a label on it and making 3 points, what would you ask people to note, I suppose? And if people, I think it's quite, we'll allow you to be rude and turn around and look if you like, because you can see these little animals. You can see the skeletal fish. You can see a kind of an outline of a terrain, of a map. So you immediately spot, as I say, little details. And then there are signs for hazard, for danger warning as well. So what's at first might seem to be quite decorative, pretty, aesthetic, certainly in terms of the colour, even with the sort of darker black and green, then on closer inspection is perhaps more dystopian.
Yeah, that was the, yeah.
I know, I'm not, but can you maybe point out a tiny bit of
I think it's important to say that this is kind of a deconstruction and reconstruction of a canonical form, embroidery, that you can see there, that comes from a very specific city in Uzbekistan that is located in the steppe, almost next to the desert. It's called Nurata. And it is important to say that the embroiderers that I work with, Yulduz and her team, they are from Nurata. Yeah. So it is a personal piece to them as well. So kind of deconstructing the canon and then building a narrative around this canon and kind of putting it on there with help of Yulduz and with consultation from Yulduz, and also was quite, it was a great journey, I think. And also I always explain this piece as a sort of a collaboration between artist, artisan and AI, like a triangle, because the AI also kind of supported in creating this new language and this new vocabulary that is based on the canon, but also incorporates these new ideas and new details and things, and rethinks different patterns that exist. For example, you know, that you have that pahtagul sort of ornament that is on plates, and you know, you would be familiar with that, and then puts in the context and so on. Yeah, and I think it's important to note that in the process, I was showing these results of the AI and my experimentation, my hypotheses to Yulduz. And then, you know, as I mentioned to you earlier, for example, the biochemical hazard sign, and talking about like invoking childhood memories and stuff. For her, it kind of brought up a memory of her as a child in Soviet Uzbekistan, playing next to the hills of the Nuratau mountains and finding these areas that were kind of closed up with a fence with the sign on it. And at the time, she didn't realize what that was, but now kind of thinking of it, she was like, oh, this is actually, you know, a daily kind of situation for us, and maybe it was even quite dangerous to be around there, but this is the reality, you know. And also, this is kind of the region that is slowly also being devastated by the fact that the rivers are being had been diverted for irrigation of cotton. So we come back to cotton and the RLC that dried up. And yeah, it's impacting women disproportionately, especially in Karakalpakstan, which is where the RLC used to be. Well, it kind of still is, but not very much of it. You know, they don't have good water and anything, and yeah, it's a big.
Yeah, I think in fact it's a hugely politically contentious topic, but poetically really captured, I think, in the work. But as I say, it's I love the idea that when you close up, you kind of the different then little pockets of details actually immediately, like the warning sign, sort of immediately alert you sort of to more socio-political detail. Yeah, like I didn't. And the way again the ending, it's blocked by chairs there, but the fact that it sort of it bleeds out, it unravels, it continues. That sense it seems also poignant to.
Yeah, it is a nod to a tradition where you do not finish the embroideries. Yes. First of all, because you know you cannot finish an embroidery because then there won't be a future kind of thing. You know, you have to leave it for the future generations. You have to kind of let it continue, and it's a sign of good luck if you leave it unfinished. And this is where I left it unfinished. But also, if you look closely at each of the embroideries, you might find little parts that were not finished by the artisans themselves. Yeah, because it's so kind of ingrained in their practice that they feel bad if they finish something because it's bad luck. So yeah, that.
I have one last question,
Yeah.
which is about the notion of self-exoticization, because this is something, your self-exoticization archive, where you're, again, using technology to be self-questioning, because I think that's also important. Archives inform a lot of your work on its collective nature, but not as something that is a kind of a history or history or something that's fixed, yeah, in a very sort of, as we might think of them, in more colonial and certainly in terms of a kind of Anglo-American concept. So for you, archives are much more people-centered, the commons, etc. But within that, I think you're quite self-conscious, so you're delving into that. You're unraveling, I suppose, elements about how you're inscribing and reinscribing yourself. And you're between Uzbekistan, but your studio, as I say, is in London. You're exhibiting in Milan and Berlin, here in Pushkin House. So you're kind of, we're sort of back to that global slide we had at the start. And negotiating the boundaries between nations and identities and what you're using and stories you're telling on behalf and with people is something that is informing a lot of the recent work, and it's about performativity. So how then do you, and you're also active on social media, so that kind of comes into it, but how do you feel about your own performativity and this term that you've used, but it is one which is theorized in terms of post-colonial and diasporic kind of debates?
I never know what's the right way to say it. Is it self-exoticization or self-exotification?
Exoticization.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Well, hang on. So here we go. I was trying to get, so this is where, I think this is quite, in terms of the exotic, yes, yeah. and sort of the,
so this project,
oneself.
Yeah, this project it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek project, so it didn't start out seriously, but then people seem to resonate as I think every single project of mine starts with like, and then people are like, oh, I'm like, oh, okay, actually. But
you're being ungenerous to yourself in the sense that it's more thought out or conceived, but maybe think of, okay, continue.
This has evolved past kind of the videos and performance, and recently in Milan, actually, I've shown embroideries that are inspired by these AI kind of conversations. And I think the whole idea of the project is built around this notion that a lot of actually Central Asian women artists face. And there's a lot of conversations around it where, you know, they're either actively exoticized or being accused of exoticization, which is kind of a, you know, you can't win kind of situation. And for me specifically as well, because I work with such kind of ornamental forms that are really easy to exoticize. How do I kind of continue and justify for myself? Am I using these patterns because they're so attractive and pretty and so on, or is there actually a deeper purpose? Which I know there is a deeper purpose, because I don't really care for the ornamentality. I care for the idea of it being a visual language. But then unless I explain that to people, people are like, oh, it's so pretty.
It does tease out your imprinting and printing and layering. I think that sort of flows through in the sense of where we see a kind of metamorphosis or morphology going on in the works. I think it's quite nice, or it resonates perfectly with the other work in terms of a layering that can be stripped back or pushed forward. But when you say it's kind of something that you feel is resonating with people, it is again something that's evolving. And this is the show you just mentioned. You're just ended, I think, in Milan, no? Her stage. But does it mean that actually when we're coming back to the sort of full circle again, it's the notion of the stage, the performance, the performativity, but perhaps where a lot of your work is putting the audience into the position of performer. Now the spotlight is terribly or very much back on you again. And I also wondered, I think I'd sort of mentioned that when we were having coffee earlier, there's a huge, or there must be, after doing a Venice Biennale and a pavilion so several shows, there must be a kind of question of where to next, and the fact that you are in the eye of us all, so that it's both a blessing and a curse at once. And is that sort of informing to your sort of paring back and playing with your own image, perhaps, or it's certainly, or pushing it? Or are you going to abandon that altogether now? And
no,
is there a new vista ahead?
There's new stuff ahead, and I'm really excited about it. I think, how do I put this? Yeah, I was very lucky to do all these things and to be given this opportunity to really kind of go deeply into the research that I'm doing. Now I do feel, for example, with the embroidery and the AI, I've reached a certain point where I'm like, okay, enough of this now. I can put it aside and try new things, which I'm going to be doing, because, for example, now I'm doing a fellowship, like I have a creative technologies fellowship that I'm doing with Somerset House and the Creative Computing Institute. And the goal of that is actually trying to kind of go beyond and try other ways of engaging with technology, maybe moving away from AI and creating more of like responsive environments, because as you said, you know, I like putting people into a situation where they're performing unknowingly and so on, and this is going to be a continuation of that, where they unknowingly perform an environment and then the environment responds, and that environment is created by textiles and so on. So this is something that I'm researching right now, and I'm also doing a really interesting commission for the Zeppelin Museum, which is a museum about Zeppelins, about the airships, which I'm really excited about, because there's nothing further away from my practice than a Zeppelin. Like I would never naturally come to that subject, but kind of having this very different background and coming in and looking at the story of the Zeppelin as an outsider, and my project is pretty much about that, is quite exciting to me. So there's going to be some changes and some new things, but I think still, you know, the underlying currents and everything that I'm interested in is still the same. Like the performativity is never going to go. Yeah. The idea of this like theater performance, I think is going to stay, and the textiles are going to stay, because I don't think I've exhausted that fully, and I don't think I will for a long time. So
we're all delighted to hear that. No, it's very exciting. I'm sure there are some questions before, but otherwise, can I please ask everyone to thank Aziza for her fabulous conversation.
And Alyce.
Do we want to? I think there's time for one or two questions from the floor, Denis, if people have them on anything we've talked about. Yes. Sorry, Katie. Yes, Katie Deepa.
Can I ask a question about your use of AI? Because you said that you keep your data separate. So are you, when you make things like this behind us, are you, do you have a database of different embroidery techniques that you're playing with, that you run through ChatGPT or something like that? Well, I mean, what are you doing with AI to actually end up with this? So which you couldn't do through your imagination. What is it doing?
I can do it. I can do it with my imagination, but I want to be surprised. I work with the image base, like an image generating AI, which is open source. So you can go in and use it, and you can train a little bit of it using your own images. So I've collected my own kind of data set of different images that are from the embroidery, and then I put it into this AI, and I have a little locus of this AI that sort of uses my style and does things. But sometimes, because it's not built by me fully, the whole structure, it's built by somebody in probably the United States. I don't know where, but I need to look into that. But definitely Western. The bigger database obviously also reflects the fact where the AI comes from. So sometimes the biases seep in, and this is something that I look at as well. So, and when I work with AI, I never use the immediate output that the AI spits out, because for me it is a conversation, and that's why the artwork is also called the Conversations with AI. So I would give an AI that I pre-trained an image to interpret, and I never put any verbal prompts. So I don't put words to kind of respect this idea of a visual language and see how the AI kind of interprets that image, and then it gives me several outputs. And then it's my turn. I would take one output that I think is interesting, and I would modify it and work on it and put it back. And then there's this kind of loop, feedback loop, a kind of conversation, and you can see like the sequences there as well. So these are the sequences that were made through these conversations. Sometimes like these are more coherent, one of those words, coherent, and then but most of them are kind of really random. So usually there's thousands of images that I then curate and edit as well. So none of these are like the final outputs, because they're usually not that pretty. So this is the one way I use AI, but I also kind of work with machine learning. So there's the Her Stage project also uses AI, but it uses pose estimation. So it kind of looks at videos of movement and dance and looks at the pose and the choreography and then generates new choreography from that. So it's another way to work with it.
Hi, Aziza. I just want to know how the embroidery was done, if it's done by hand.
By hand.
And by hand.
Yeah.
That's impressive on its own. And where was it all done?
Yeah.
Where?
Okay. It was, so as I said, I work with Yıldız Muhyiddinova, who is an artisan, but even though she is a master kind of embroiderer herself, she now works more as a producer of these things. So she has women that she collaborates with, and usually these are women that just embroider kind of as a side thing, like an extra little money earning thing, which is great because I love to support them.
It's a great concept.
Yeah. And they are mostly based in Nurata, back in the town, which is not really far from Bukhara. And usually how it works is that, you know, they have free 2 hours between feeding their baby and like cooking dinner, and they would sit down and embroider. And usually it's also with families. So one family specializes on the chain stitch, the other family specializes on the satin, like needle stitch. And for example, for that piece, we had to do like logistics of like, okay, they embroider the chain stitch, and then we have to move it here and then put this back, because there's a combination of these different stitches. So it's really interesting to look at. And to me, I think being able to help women gain a bit of economic, I won't say independence because it's not, but like have a little extra money on the side is my little contribution.
That sounds wonderful. Someone who's from Central Asia myself, so I think it's a really great thing. Also because you were talking about storytelling in childhood, and like anyone in Central Asia, I grew up with carpets all around you. And so I remember still as a child, I used to look at the carpets and tell the story. So it was always a story that was told, right? So you never just looked at the carpet as just something on the wall. There was a story to be told.
And with all the patterns, and you'd make up like little monsters.
Exactly. And there's some story that maybe your mom tells you, but then there's also completely different story that you tell your friends if you wanted to, because you can interpret it in different ways, and also the color and shapes and so on. So the question that I had as well, how long would one of those embroideries take?
I think both of these separately took maybe 3 or 4 months.
And
but there were several people. Several.
Yeah. Okay. I love, sorry for taking over here, I'm just really excited about having a Central Asian and multinational artist here in London. And and I guess this idea of identity, and I just mentioned it before, just in this, a little bit, so I'm of German origin, but I grew up in Central Asia. And so, for example, for me now, someone who lives here and lived in different countries, there's this idea of who I am and how do I represent myself. So one of the things that I would love to do, for example, is to have something that Kazakh or Central Asian, and that represents me as who I am. And I cannot even ask anything like German from Central Asia. That's like a step further. But the thing is, Central Asia is very multicultural. So in, you know, being German is just one of those. But one thing that I miss, and last year or the year before I went to Kazakhstan and I looked exactly for that, for embroideries and textiles. And to say, if I go and I perform somewhere or I speak somewhere, can I have a dress where people look at me and say, oh yeah, she's from Central Asia? Like this kind of having something that people recognize as Central Asian, or to create something that people will eventually recognize as Central Asian, that would be something really wonderful. And I haven't come across anything like that. And so for me it was wonderful to see all of this combination of tradition and something new, and the wonderful colors, so it's great. So I'm gonna create a dress. I'm gonna go to Uzbekistan.
No, there's a lot of wonderful Kazakh artists who are kind of working with, with tradition, and specifically, so Kazakh tradition is more connected to felt as well. So kind of around felt and the tactility of that. But also in terms of, you know, design and dresses, there's plenty to discover, and I can give you some pointers. Yeah. Yeah.
If there's one more, okay, one more there from the lady, yes. In a nutshell.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'm very interested how to you using artificial intelligence and your own concepts and designs. So my question is related to your experiment with choreography, because I can recognize Shirin Jalilova.
Yes.
Yeah, I know her personally. She's been in my house.
She came to your events, I think. She told me about it.
She was performing at our annual reception. So my question is, why you've decided to experiment with choreography, and what was the purpose?
Yeah.
What did you want to achieve?
It's
by that?
It's a story of my grandmother. So it's called Her Stage, and it's really her, you know, my grandmother's stage, and she's alive and well. She's 85 years old, and she tells her own story. So basically, the installation consists of it's a series of kind of sculptures, soft sculptures, and also a video where you have Shirin, and you have kind of my grandmother's story and storytelling. And the premise is her unrealized dream of becoming a folk dancer in the 1950s. My grandmother, yeah. So, and it kind of, you know, through her telling and like different reasons why, you know, Mukarram Turgunbayeva, who you know about probably, who is the founder of the most famous, well-known kind of dance ensemble, Bahor, she kind of used to pester my grandmother, being like, oh, why don't you join? But then, you know, so she talks about it, and she, basically through the storytelling, you understand, oh, okay, there's these bigger political reasons, there's the reasons like patriarchy and so on and so on. So this is what the project is about. But I really wanted to celebrate this kind of, I guess, not really realized journey, because even though my grandmother never became a professional dancer, she carried this kind of desire for the spotlight through her entire life. And there's a bunch of photographs of her dancing, and she would always be the first person to invite it to a dance floor and so on. And that manifested in other aspects of her life as well. So not just dance, but kind of performance in general in real life. But now, so before she had these kind of mental and like not physical restrictions, and now kind of she doesn't leave her apartment because she's not really able to. She can move around the apartment. She has a very physical restriction, and she has a very set choreography around her space. So it's kind of this not physical restriction, metaphysical restriction becoming physical. And I wanted to create this choreography that never happened. So what happened, I invited Shirin, who worked with Qizlar earlier, I think maybe last year for the 8th of March celebrations. And she was very kind, and I told her basically the stories that my grandmother told me, and she came up, she didn't create new dances or interpretative dances, but she actually excavated some classical dances and movements and so on that could be relevant to the stories, or like that resonated with her in terms of storytelling. And then we recorded those dances and the movements. So there was a database of traditional classical dance that kind of never happened for my grandmother, and then I had a database of my grandmother's movement now. And then with the AI, we kind of combined those together, and there was this kind of corrupted choreography that never happened, that was only on the screen. And then the sculptures are actually different gestures that are then taken from this non-existent choreography and you know, realized as physical pieces that show this movement. Sometimes unrealistic movement, because, you know, AI sometimes comes up with things that humans can't really do. So that was the premise.
Fantastic. And that's, to be clear, that's in Berlin, in the Kindle.
Yeah, this one, so right now there's 2 pieces on display. This one's in Berlin. This is in Berlin until end of January. In Kindle Center for Contemporary Art. And then the other piece was in Milan.
Yeah. And that's just closed as well, has it not?
Well, it closed in December, but I think they still haven't taken it down, so yeah.
The links are still, you can find them on your website now, so if people want to have another look. No, you don't have a link, no.
No, I need to update that.
Yeah.
No. I have a lot of work
Homework
to do.
Tomorrow morning to add those, yes. But thank you for questions, thank you for answers, and
thank you,
Denis, for having us.
Thank you so much, Alyce and Aziza. And the bar is open. You're welcome to stay in and mingle as well. Thank you so much. Come again.